So we continue my video cut there. So we were talking about explain the functions of the part labeled E and F. So we talked about the function of the part labeled E. It holds the sporangium in position, supplies nutrients to the spores that are found in the sporangium, or transports water and mineral salts. You could have actually talked about that. What about the part labeled F, which is simply the storon? Yeah, that one we can simply say is a filament. So you can simply say is a filament that forms the mycelium. So it forms up a mycelium, which is a thread-like structure in fungi. So that is what you could have talked about there. Then if you notice there, the other question there, let me just fold it so that you are able to see here. It says out C1, outline the process of nutrition carried out by the fungus in figure 2. So what they showed us, what does it do? So outline the process. Well, you can simply say that, the fungus, so we can say the fungus, feeds on dead and decaying organic matter by secreting, so we can say by secreting extracellular digestive enzymes, that hydrolyzes. So to hydrolyze means to dissolve. That hydrolyzes the substrate. Substrate is simply the food substance on which it actually works. So after hydrolyzing, then what it does is that absorbs the end product. So it actually absorbs the end products through the feeding hyphae. So that's what it does. So through the feeding hyphae by diffusion. So it could either be by diffusion or by active transport. So depending on what is actually happening. So you can zoom it in so that you are able to see. So this is the action and you get your 3 marks. Give an example of a fungus that carry out the process of nutrition shown. So this is what we call saprophytic nutrition. So those that carry out, saprophytic, nutrition, we can simply, those that actually are able to carry out saprophytic, we can talk about the muca and also what we call as being a rhizopath. So these are able to carry out, this type of nutrition. Very important. We can move on and come to question number 3. So question number 3 says figure 3 shows a kind of germination in a seed after it was placed in a well-watered, so it was placed in a well-watered, soil. Then it says what characteristic of a living thing is demonstrated by the sequence in figure 3. So you can see stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. What is being shown here is what we call as being growth. So there's a permanent increase in size and mass, and therefore growth is simply the characteristic in living organism that is demonstrated. Remember those characteristics in living things? You can remember Mrs. Green: movement, respiration, sensitivity, growth, reproduction, excretion, and nutrition. So you can still remember that. Then B says identify the parts labeled H and I. So what are the parts labeled H and I? So H, if you want, you could have actually said it is actually a shoot there. So a shoot, is what we sometimes call as being the promule, because a promule will later on develop into a shoot. Or if you want, you can simply say a young water, a young shoot. They would have accepted that. Then I is representing what we are calling as being a radical, or if you want, it is a young radical. So radical is what later on develops into a rod. So you need to remember that it later on develops into a rod. So basically, you would have actually talked about that. So those are important aspects that we can talk about. Then I'll move on to another question there, so that we are able to see what is happening. So C1 says state the kind of germination shown in figure 3. So the type of germination that you are able to see in this figure, notice that this here is what we call as being the cotyledon. So it's a cotyledon that has actually been raised above the ground, if you notice. So what type? So you need to remember, when the cotyledon is raised above the ground, it simply means that that is apigeal germination. So that is what we call. In fact, if you look at the word epi, you can say it simply means above. So why? If the cotyledon has been raised above the ground, then that is epigeal. But if it remains underground, then it's simply like the endosperm, then that is hypogeal germination, which actually happens in males. So give a reason for your answer. So they wanted us to give. So I can simply say because the cotyledons are raised. So the cotyledons are raised above the ground. So because the cotyledons are raised above the ground, that is the reason why we are actually saying that it is apigeal germination. So this type of germination, apigeal, happens in beans. That's what we mean. But hypogeal happens in things like mains that we are talking about. Then D says explain the importance of water in seed germination. So why is water important in seed germination? Well, water is important. We can simply say it helps to activate the enzyme. So one, water will help to activate the enzyme. Then two, it softens the tester, what we call as being the seed coat. So it actually softens that, so that the materials are easy to pass through it. Then apart from that, we can simply say it hydrolyzes. So it actually hydrolyzes. So to hydrolyze, it actually hydrolyzes or dissolved stored, food. So it actually, for example, they may have stored starch. That starch may actually be converted into maltose when enzyme talk about it. So it provides a medium where reactions are simply going to be taking place. So you could have talked about a lot, even things like provide the oxygen for the developing embryo. Water does all that, providing oxygen for the developing embryo. Let's try to move on and look at the other question, that is question number 4, and see how you could have actually gone about it. So this question is coming from the endocrine system. It says figure 4 shows the spinal reflex arc. So this is a spinal reflex arc. Yeah, so that is the spinal reflex arc, and this is what they're telling you. Then it says, if you can see, you could have actually labeled this part. So this part here is what we call as being the sensory neuron. So this is the sensory neuron, and that sensory neuron will pass through the dorsal root. Then the one labeled O there is representing the relay neuron, sometimes called the interneuron or intermediate neuron. That's what they call it. Then K is representing what we call as being the gray matter, and L is representing the white, so that is the white matter. Then N is representing the motor neuron, and M is representing the effector. So effectors carry out a response to an electrical impulse, they can either be muscles or they can be glands. So that is what you need to remember. So very important. Then right in the middle, there's a portion that carries neurospinal, fluid that helped to cushion the spinal cord. So now, with that in mind, if you are able to pick up that it says identify the parts labeled J and L. So what are the parts labeled J and L? So J, we didn't label it. We could have actually say, that is a receptor, or if I want, I can simply say sensory receptor. So that is a receptor, or another person might have just said, receptor. That would have also sufficed. Then what about L? It is representing the white matter. So that is the white matter. So that is what they wanted you to do in this exam. Notice B, it says explain the function of the parts labeled M and O. So what is the function of the part labeled M? M is the effector. So what do the effectors actually do? We can simply say that, they carry out a response to an electrical impulse. So they help to carry out a response to an electrical impulse, and thereby, in other words, if you want, they bring about, if you want, you could have said brings about an action. So they help to bring about an action. For example, if I touch a hot object, I need to remove it. So meaning they'll bring about an action that is going to result. Then O, if you go back to O, that is the relay neuron. What does it do? Well, that one actually, we can simply say, it actually transmits. So we can say transmits, impulses from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. So that's what it does. So it transmits impulses. Another thing that you could have talked about for O, we can say it forms a connection. So if you wanted, you could have said it also forms a connection between, sensory and motor neuron. So it actually helps to form a connection between the sensory as well as the motor neuron. So basically that is what is going to happen. And you guys, you need to remember that so that you are able to answer your questions correctly. Okay, let's move on to that part. It simply says that which two letters in figure 4 form part of the spinal cord. So the ones that form part of the spinal cord, the gray matter and the white matter. So it is simply K, and you would have talked about L. So K and L. Give one example of a spinal reflex action. So a spinal reflex action is where, impulses are able to pass through the spinal cord. So what are some examples where the common one that we can simply talk about is, withdraw reflex. Like I said, when I touch an object that is hot, I'll remove my hand. So it's called a withdraw reflex. Or you can simply talk about a knee-jerk reflex. Those are spinal. They pass through the spinal cord to bring about a response. Cranial are those that are passing through the brain before bringing about, a response. And many of them that we can talk about is maybe, when a person is sneezing, salivating. We can talk about, blinking. Yeah, even a coughing reflex may actually suffice under this one there. So then E says, what is the overall function of the nervous system? What does the nervous system do? Well, the overall function of the nervous system, we can simply say it actually controls, or it helps to coordinate, body actions which require, so it helps to coordinate body actions which require quick response. So that's what it does. So it either controls or coordinate body actions which require quicker responses, and that is what the nervous system basically does. So at least hopefully you got some ideas and you can actually get to use them in the exam. Let's conclude with question number 5. That is a question for genetics. It will not miss. Genetics will always be there. So A1 says, what is mutation? Well, mutation is a spontaneous, so we can say is a spontaneous change in the chemical, let me say in the chemical structure of a gene or number of chromosomes. So the spontaneous change in the chemical structure of a gene or number of chromosomes that are there. So that's what we call mutation. Remember, when I say chemical structure of a gene, there are things like adenine, which goes with thymine. There's guanine, which goes with cytosine. So when these nitrogenous bases change, then that is going to actually result in a gene mutation. But if the number of chromosomes either increase or decrease, that will result in chromosome. So mutation is general. It's simply a spontaneous change either in the number of chromosomes or the structure of a gene that you have, and that's what we call as being mutation. Hope that is clear. Then 582, Roman 2 there says state 2 causes of mutation. So one, we can simply talk about viruses. So viruses, e.g. you have got maybe the HIV virus, it is able to cause that. Then we can simply talk about radiation. So radiation is able to cause that. Maybe a person is exposed to too much X-rays, you can have written that. It is actually, possible. Yeah, there are also what we call chemical, dyes that a person may be using. Sometimes prolonged intake of preservatives, too much intake of preservatives may also lead to what we are calling as being mutation. So you see, you could have actually written quite a number of them that are there. So what is important, at least get to know 2 or 3, then that is going to help you in the exam that you'll be writing there. Then B, our last question in section A says a couple both with normal skin color produced an albino. Explain using a genetic diagram how this would have been possible. Use the alleles capital A and small a to represent genes for skin color. So remember they said a couple both normal skin color, but they had a child who was an albino. So how is it possible? The only way this is possible is when both of them are simply, carriers. So let's try to see how you could have done it here. P1, remember as always, you start with the phenotype. So that is going to be the phenotype. We can simply say, normal, skin color. Yeah, let me say male, crossing in this case again with normal, skin color. I can say female. I'll just abbreviate it like that. Then you need to go to the genotype. What is in the genotype? Like I told you, for them to have a child who is an albino, it simply means that they were both carriers. So meaning when you are writing the genotype, it will be heterozygous. Hetero means different. So capital letter and small letter. And there you have capital letter, small letter. So these will separate when meiosis takes place to produce gametes or sex cells. So capital A, I love to circle it, small a, capital A, and small a there. Then they will now pair the first one and the first one there. This one and that one. Put them at an angle. Not that you're playing. You should be answering questions as if you're writing for the last time. That's the key, to passing. Then F1, when it comes to the genotype, what would be the genotype of the children? So to be capital A, and that would be capital A, small a, capital A, small a. Remember, start with a dominant allele, not the recessive allele. Why? So start with a capital letter, then a small letter, then A. So what is the interpretation of the genotype as represented by the phenotype? You can see that this person had, normal skin color. So that was normal skin color. This one was actually a carrier of the allele that causes, skin color. This one was also a carrier, and this one was actually sick, or as we call it, albino. So this child was actually an albino. So how is that possible? Remember, it says how, explain how this would have been possible. So it would have been possible, so both, parents, must be carriers. So both parents must actually be carriers of the allele that causes albinism for their children, for them to have a child who is an albino. Thank you so much for watching. Please watch out for my other videos, paper 1, so that you could easily, again, revise easily as you write this week. Thank you so much for watching.